Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to put you to sleep with these terrifying tales of poor choices. Before we begin, please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I would also like to know where you're from and what time you're watching this, so please leave a comment. Get relaxed and comfy when you're ready. Hi, everyone, and pleasant evening. My name is Karen, and I live with my 6-year-old daughter, Leah, in a modest little home in a Little Oregon neighborhood. Since my divorce, I've tried my hardest to restore some kind of normalcy to our lives, even though things can get difficult at times. Leah is the reason I keep getting up and battling, because she is everything to me. In any case, it all began with a gift I recently gave her. I got her a My Little Pony doll for her birthday, and she was immediately captivated by it. Leah played with her doll all day long, creating stories and imaginary worlds. I had not really thought about it, to be honest. I only saw it as a means of amusing her. But to Leah, it was a companion and something she greatly valued. But one weekend, when I met Lionel at a local festival, everything changed. While we were playing games and Leah was excitedly carrying her doll around, a man who appeared to be in his 20s or so approached us while we were standing by a clothing kiosk. He said, "That doll is very special," but I thought his voice tone wasn't quite right. Too sentimental for a simple toy, and even more so for an adult. After introducing himself as a collector, he continued to discuss cartoon programs, internet auctions, and similar topics. In all honesty, I felt a little uneasy about his fascination with animated shows, collectible toys, and the like. But Leah was totally unaware of it, grinning and cuddling her doll as though it were her best friend. A few days after that, I got an odd message from a number I didn't know. "Hello, this is Lionel, the fair collector. Would you be interested in selling the figurine? I make a good living." I opted to ignore him after being a little frightened that he had my number because I couldn't remember giving it to him. However, 2 days later, the guy wrote again, this time with an even more alluring offer, but I wasn't interested, so I blocked him and replied emphatically no. While Leah was sleeping that night, I sensed someone skulking around the home. As I peered out the window, I noticed a shadow moving across the backyard. I felt like I was overstating things, but I couldn't let myself be watched, so before I tried to fall asleep, I made sure everything was in its proper place by checking all the windows and doors. At breakfast the following day, Leah said something that made my spine tingle. "Mom, I spotted the man from yesterday's park. He was outside." She spoke so quietly, as though it were the most commonplace thing, as though it weren't significant. Conversely, I nearly lost my cool. I was instantly frightened and urged her to avoid that guy and to notify me if she saw him again. As night fell, I switched on a lamp in the living room and attempted to focus on a book to try to unwind, but at around 2 in the morning, sounds began to come. First a creak by the windows, and then a very gentle rap on the rear door. I was overcome with fear at that moment, but I made an effort to remain composed. I carefully took up my phone, and as I headed to the living room, I dialed 911, but when I arrived, nobody was there. Since everything appeared to be silent, I assumed it was all in my head. But I noticed something on the ground that wasn't there previously, a folded piece of paper. I opened the note with shaking hands and read, "Give me the doll. You don't have to make it difficult." All I had to do was read those lines to feel my blood chill. When I called the police, they came right away but said they couldn't locate anything. Other than patrolling the area in case they noticed something unusual, there wasn't much they could do. I made the decision that night for Leah to spend the night in my room. Everything proceeded without a hitch the following day, and I believed that perhaps the man had given up after noticing the police patrol. But 3 nights later, the thing I was most afraid of happened. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a huge commotion that sounded like someone busting down the back door. This time, I called 911 right away and went downstairs with a bat I kept under my bed rather than standing there paralyzed. I noticed Lionel attempting, when I peered out the window, to use a tool of some type to open one of the windows. He appeared desperate and completely out of it, as though he had taken something odd. I yelled at him from inside to startle him, but he continued. Before I could respond, he abruptly busted the window and went into the home. Then, like a rocket, Adrenaline rushed through my veins. The man appeared to be preparing to jump me based on the crazed expression in his eyes, but I wasn't sure what he had in mind. I felt certain that wasn't going to be favorable. He lunged at me when I eventually told him to go, and before I could do anything, he grabbed the bat from me. I felt like everything was lost at that point, but I didn't give up. When I took away the bat, I thought I had caused him to lose his equilibrium a little. Taking advantage of the situation, I grabbed a candlestick from a little side table and smashed it over his head. The man appeared stunned, as though he had forgotten what he was doing. Then, with all of my remaining strength, I was able to reclaim the bat from him and began striking him. He made an attempt to strike me back, but it was too late. He struggled for a few minutes before giving up and running out the window, vanishing into the night's darkness. The police searched the house when they got there a few minutes later, but Lionel was already quite far away. The broken window was all that was left, indicating that it had indeed occurred. I believed I had survived the worst of it and that night would be a watershed, but I was completely mistaken. About 3 a.m, 4 days later, I was roused by a scent. I initially believed it to be a nightmare, but the heat quickly got to be too much. As soon as I opened the bedroom door, a heavy cloud of smoke filled the hallway. I was overcome with panic at that very moment. I rushed into Leah's room, where she was in a condition of screaming, of complete panic. The smoke was growing thicker, and I realized that breathing it in would be fatal for us both, so I grabbed her up and quickly left the area. But in the midst of all of this, I began to feel weak, and to my horror, I thought I was going to faint, but I did everything I could to keep upright. I had to do it for Leah, so I eventually recovered my strength, and we were able to escape the smoke and flames. When we eventually stepped out the door, I looked back at our house and watched how painfully the flames ate it up. The fire department had already been contacted by the other neighbors, but it was too late to try to conserve anything. All I could do was hold Leah while we watched everything turn to ashes, because I knew it. Our house was a burned-out shell by the time the firefighters eventually extinguished the fire, and many of our possessions, including those that Leah cherished, were gone. Investigators found that someone in the neighborhood was responsible for starting the fire. Lionel was taken into custody later that week after the surveillance camera saw him in our patio shortly before the first fire. The man didn't even express regret during the trial. In fact, he grinned when they brought up the damaged doll, as though his victory were the most significant event. Leah would occasionally inquire about her doll, since she was unable to really comprehend what had transpired. I tried using other toys to divert her attention, but all I could think about was how nearly we had lost everything due to a sick person's insane passion. Even now, I felt distressed by the situation's ridiculousness and the threat it proved to be. Basically, a dumb doll nearly burned my kid and I to death. Lionel received a sentence to spend a number of years behind bars, but that didn't make me feel better. Since our house was restored, I have made it a habit to check the doors and windows at least a few times each night. I keep thinking about the look on his face, that eerie fusion of obsession and lunacy. After that, Leah missed her doll a lot. I often pondered whether I ought to find another one. But as soon as I realized what had transpired, I abandoned the notion. In addition, it was a collector's item, a limited edition item that was challenging to obtain, which is exactly what drove that lunatic to carry out all of his actions. I make an effort to be more involved in my daughter's upbringing, but being a single mother has challenges. I sometimes make a concerted effort to convince myself that I wasn't at fault, but I can't help but believe that if I hadn't given her that doll, none of this would have occurred. Before I get started, I'm not sure if Latin American nations do something similar, but in England, it's typical to purchase groceries and have someone deliver them. It right to your door. Imagine a potentially kind and attractive driver packing your purchases into a van and delivering them to your house. Of course, the likelihood that that person is me is 90% if you reside in Nottingham. Since the pandemic started, more people are using immediate delivery services, particularly in December, which made me work nonstop. It was incredibly draining to work 8 days in a row from 7 in the morning till 8 at night. And that tension and exhaustion serve as the backdrop for the tale I'm going to share with you. I was delivering a lot of orders one night when I observed that the streets were abnormally quiet, which is not always the case, but that's what I discovered. I noticed blue lights flashing in my rearview mirror all of a sudden. My heart began to beat a bit more quickly than usual. After waiting a little while to see whether it would pass me, I chose to pull over and wait for instructions because it was still behind me. As the vehicle got closer, I realized it wasn't your typical patrol car. I was a little perplexed because the man who got out of the car wasn't wearing a uniform, and it was a regular model of Renault Clio, but I didn't give it much thought. When I rolled down the window, the man with the COVID mask came over, flashed his police credentials, and shouted "Drug Squad" before requesting my driver's license. I told him my data out of habit since I thought this might be serious, but I had a gut feeling that something wasn't quite right. But since drug offenses are widespread in Nottingham, I didn't give much thought to the possibility that the dude wasn't dressed consistently. After looking through my ID, the man began to explain that they were pursuing a large criminal group that transported goods via couriers like me. When he requested for my permission to examine the back of my van, I naturally complied. I hoped everything was all right, so I put on the mask and went out of the taxi to open the back door. However, as soon as I opened the door, I saw that the officer in the rear wasn't handling things with much care. He began to roughly search about. I kept silent at first because I didn't want to take the chance of saying something that might cause me problems, especially since they were searching for drug traffickers. But it was really starting to worry me. I found it somewhat odd that the officer's companion got out of the car because neither of them was wearing uniforms, and he also began searching the van. They appeared committed to doing a thorough job. Police number 2 dug into the glove compartment and conducted a fairly thorough search of the cabin as police number 1 kept searching my trunk. Angry at the actions of both cops, I made the decision to go and take a look. Upon my arrival, I observed the first police officer flinging fragile items on the ground and essentially ruining everything in the van. The reality is that things were getting out of hand. At last, I mustered the confidence to speak. "Hey, please be a little more careful with my stuff?" I asked, attempting to seem forceful but courteous. One of them responded angrily, without pausing at all. "So shut up." His response simply astounded me. Although I had previously dealt with impatient police officers, this was a whole new level. Following the so-called policeman's abuse, I informed him that I was complying perfectly and that there was no need for that attitude. His buddy then made the decision to play the good guy in this bad cop, good policeman combination. He expressed regret for the inconvenience, stressed the importance of his work, and then, as if I were concealing something, told me that I too needed to register. Even though I was already running late for my delivery at that time, I made the decision to act like a model citizen and help them in any way I could. I was parked on a desolate, dark street when these odd officers started looking through my jacket and jeans as though I were a criminal. The search appeared to be fairly routine at first. Then he requested me to remove my jacket so he could do a more complete inspection. Even though I wasn't really pleased with the freezing night, I chose to play along. They were the law, after all. So I handed him the jacket without saying anything, but he just gave it a short glance and threw it on the ground rather than returning it to me. After he instructed me to remove my shoes, I began to feel as like things were getting out of control. Why would he act in such a way? I pondered, growing more uneasy with my current circumstances. One of the policemen then began to tell me that thieves frequently conceal cash or drugs in their clothing, but I was already at my breaking point. I consented to take off my shoes in an attempt to maintain my composure, and that's when things really started to go south. The police officer approached me from behind and began handcuffing me while holding my shoes. "We're only holding you for a little time. I will search for the narcotics before releasing your handcuffs," he said. "Which drugs?" "I'm not using any drugs," I said. The man who was handcuffing me said, "That's what we don't know yet," in a tone that half-joked me. But rather of making me feel better, it made me feel worse. Panic started to grip me. It was obvious that something was wrong, and I was starting to think that putting my trust in these so-called police officers had been a very poor choice. The most terrifying aspect of the case is that I was handcuffed barefoot and without a jacket in the middle of the street at the start of winter, and this person was pushing me toward the inside of the van. In a flash of insight, I announced that I would write down their license plate numbers in order to lodge a complaint. The officer who was escorting me at the moment, however, pushed me to the ground and said something along the lines of, "You're being a complete idiot." I couldn't believe what was taking place. Or perhaps I didn't want to. I was frustrated with myself. I was only now starting to comprehend that these two police officers were not who they claimed to be, and panic started to creep in, leaving me feeling very exposed. I became aware of how awful my circumstances were. I was now frozen in place in handcuffs as these guys began to quiz me about things unrelated to a police operation. The fact that they didn't appear to like my responses was the worst part. "Where's the cash?" They questioned me, and I wasn't sure what they wanted at the time. I assumed they were mistaking me for a drug courier or something. I made an effort to convey to them that I had no idea what they were discussing, that everything was digital these days, and that my van was empty of cash. They responded by throwing me into the back of the van, and I could see that they were threatening to shut the doors. The majority of van transporters are aware that their vehicles have that type of refrigerated compartment, and that they may be open from the inside, but I was handcuffed and everything I had, including the jacket with the keys, was on the road, so if they closed the doors on me, I might not be able to share this tale. I pleaded with them not to close the doors given what they were going to do, but they ignored me. Then I became aware of how pitiful my request sounded. Then the most embarrassing event took place. They both burst out laughing at me, mimicking my requests. The fact that they made fun of my pain in such a harsh and inhumane manner was such a terrible sensation. Then, without giving me any notice, they slammed me to the asphalt floor and removed me from the unit, nearly dislocating my shoulder in the process. To be completely honest, those were the scariest minutes of my life as I lay there groaning. Now that I think about it, I believe they were playing a game. I unknowingly played a nasty, vicious game, and that's just what they wanted. What do they get out of robbing a grocery van? Not precisely an armored bank truck or anything similar, so why target me? Perhaps they believed I might be easily frightened after seeing my foolish face. They needed someone to torture, and I was a simple target. The fact is that if they had wanted to, they could have stopped anyone and stolen an electric truck or all of their money. However, they simply enjoyed themselves at my expense. That is the thing that scares me the most. The fact that that evening served as a game and a means of entertainment for them. While I stood there, afraid and exposed, the thought that anyone might find that amusing got me to reflect on how brittle the boundary between normalcy and chaos can be, and how a straightforward delivery transformed into a night I will never forget. Fortunately, the guys just removed my handcuffs, got into their car, and drove away after laughing at my expense. After they finished, I picked up what was left of my order, reported the incident to the police, and continued making deliveries. I never heard from those people again, and they never contacted, so I had no idea if the police had visited the scene. It seems as though they didn't even consider my complaint. These days, whenever I see red and blue lights behind me, I can't help but get a chill. Fortunately, I've never seen anything like again. Right up till now, I was born in the shadow of massive mountains in a little village in the Himalayas, where I spent the most of my childhood. The majority of my neighbors were farming family that toiled the land and grew whatever they could on the slopes. However, my family was not a part of that world. We were well known in the neighborhood because my father was the village mechanic and my mother was a stay-at-home mom. My best buddies were three guys my age, Rach, Ronan, and Kabal, though I had many others. We have been together for everything since we were little. We studied, played in the fields, went to school, and more often than we'd care to admit, the adults reprimanded us for misbehaving. I had the happiest days of my life during those times. We didn't dwell on the past or the future during that period. Specifically, Kabal was from one of the wealthiest families in the community. They didn't own beautiful vehicles or houses, but they did have a lot of animals and large tracts of property in the mountains, which set them apart from the other people in our town because that was the closest thing we could get to having money. After learning a little bit about our neighborhood, you will see how significant an occurrence that happened when we turned 15 could have been. We only wanted to run, play cricket, and spend time outside at that time. At that point, Cabal suggested hosting a sleepover at his house, which sounded like a ton of fun. However, we thought it would be more interesting to sleep in a sizable lookout post on his property, which is almost in the mountains rather than at his house. Even though the settlement had electricity in the early 1990s, the countryside lacked both electricity and an internet connection. To at least somewhat brighten the darkness, we had to use our flashlights. It should go without saying that in the quiet of the night, there are no cell phones to distract us, just nature and whatever ridiculous activity we could think of. We decided to enjoy our excursion over the weekend so that we wouldn't have to worry about attending school the following day. Cabby's mom prepared our supper. She gave us some candy, a few large bottles of water, and heavy blankets because the temperature dropped below freezing at night, but it wasn't anything special, just a curry with rice. Our excitement about the sleepover was abruptly interrupted by a call from Cabby's 80-year-old grandfather. He was a loving grandfather and one of those lovely people who offer wise counsel and impart valuable life lessons that you never ask for. "Why have you all come here?" He gestured for us to get closer as he asked. This grandfather was often on his porch watching the world around him since he was too old and exhausted to do anything else. "Is it true that your mother told me you would be spending the night at the lookout post?" "Yes, grandfather," we responded cheerfully, and we want to have a great time. However, his tone abruptly grew solemn. "You need to keep in mind this. Don't abandon the lookout point when it grows dark. No matter what, would you dare to do it? What happens if we have to use the restroom?" I questioned him in jest. "Pee before you go up," he remarked sharply right away. I insisted out of curiosity, but why? "Just pay attention to me. And when it gets dark, don't touch the earth. Avoid climbing in any situation," he said gravely. Both the lads and I felt a little uneasy. We were a little alarmed by Grandpa's warning, but our spirit of adventure was too great to let it stop us. He and Rachel began to lighten the mood as we made our way to Campbell Field in an attempt to divert our attention from Grandpa's warning. We were able to relax a little with jokes and laughs before beginning the ascent up the steep ladder to the lookout tower. The stars were bright and the night was clear. From there, it felt as though we could touch the sky. It was a sight to behold. We immediately made our mattresses on the wooden floor after arriving. Since the excitement kept us up, Ratch recommended telling some scary stories to set the tone, but most of them were more humorous than frightening. We were still having a good time, though. But all of a sudden, I recalled what Grandpa had said. So I asked Cabell why he had warned us not to leave the stall after dark. He said, maybe it was just for our crops, but what did he mean in reality? How am I supposed to know? Cabell answered, but let's stay here and listen to him. We joked around for a time before dozing off in the soft night air and glittering sky. But in the middle of the night, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Campbell whispering, "Wake up, Julie, take a look at that." I opened my eyes, a little disoriented, to see Campbell standing by the railing, gazing out over the field. As I followed his eyes, I noticed movement amid the crops in the distance. "What is that?" With a slightly concerned expression, he questioned. I proposed that it might be a wild boar-like creature attempting to calm down. No, look," exclaimed Campbell, sounding both excited and alarmed. So we took a closer look. A deer abruptly hopped from one crop to another in the section field, but this animal wasn't your typical one. There was an odd glow surrounding it. "That's not typical," I whispered, and as I was speaking, I heard the crops rustling once more. Instead of the deer we were hoping to see, a wild boar showed up. Does it make sense that there was only a deer and suddenly there was a wild boar as well? Belle and I exchanged shocked looks as I asked myself. However, everything changed. A horse emerged out of nowhere, and as it got closer, we saw that its eyes were gleaming in the dark, staring right at us. We couldn't comprehend how an animal could change so drastically that it paralyzed us. The horse approached slightly, continued along the path between the crops, and then vanished once more into the shadows. However, just when we believed that things couldn't get much stranger, a stunning peacock darted into the woodland from the field. Astonished, we watched it happen. It seemed as though a mystical realm had materialized in front of us. Since it was already peculiar enough, we checked our watches. 4 a.m. was indicated by the hands. But rather than attempting to return to sleep, we pulled out the sandwiches we had prepared and began to eat. All the while our friends Rowan and Ratcha slept soundly, oblivious to the spectacle taking place all around them. When the first rays of daylight appeared, we made the decision to descend. We walked toward Campbell's house after leaving Rowan and Rachel in their quick sleep. His grandfather was already eating breakfast on the porch when we got there. He was grinning, as though he was aware of everything we had seen that evening. "Are you prepared to hear the story yet?" he asked while grinning knowingly at us. "What is it about?" In unison, we inquired, interested. "What did you witness last night?" The land's protective energy is something that shows itself to those with clean hearts. When your father bought this farm, he prayed to the village god for the land's prosperity, and this ghost showed up in return. It tends to the crops and shows up as a deer, wild boar, or horse, depending on the situation. So the spirit is responsible for those forms and apparitions. I tried to take in all the information and questioned, why does it look like different animals? That is contingent upon the observer's intentions. They can change into predators to defend themselves if they spot something malevolent. He stated patiently that it didn't want to injure you because you saw something lovely. Is that the reason you didn't want us to visit at night? Asked Cabal. That's right. If the spirit feels threatened by you, it may lead to issues. You just needed to make sure you didn't get involved, the grandfather remarked while pouring himself more tea. Cabal and I exchanged knowing looks, understanding that we wouldn't discuss what had transpired that. Grandpa alone. But I shall never forget that night with its odd creatures and the wonder of the unknown. Since then, whenever we had sleepovers, we would frequently gaze up at the sky with a grin on our faces, understanding that something greater than ourselves was looking after our farms and keeping eye over us. In 1994, Luke and Sarah lived in a quiet area in Ohio and were eager to start planning their wedding. They only wanted a straightforward ceremony, nothing fancy, surrounded by their closest family members and friends, since neither of them liked being overly pompous gatherings, so everything was planned for a stunning garden party they would never forget. Luke and Sarah had met while standing in line at the grocery store a few years prior, and they fell in love right away. They went on their first date to a cafe in their immediate area, and the location evolved into the gathering spot where they would assemble each morning. The coffees soon became dates, and the dates became a lovely partnership. After 2 years of dating, Sarah and Luke were deeply in love. The big day finally came, and their loved ones watched them with smiles and tears of joy as they both strolled down a path strewn in flowers in the direction of the altar. Upon arriving at the altar, the officiant started the ceremony by discussing the love they had developed and the amazing future they had ahead of them. There was an air of sheer joy and enthusiasm, and emotions were flowing high with the sporadic tear of emotion. Sarah and Luke exchanged apprehensive smiles as they gazed into each other's eyes. But just when it appeared like everything would be fine, a voice came from the returning, totally breaking the moment's enchantment. Suddenly, a woman approached and said, "Stop," with a furious expression. "Luke, you can't wed her. I'm your spouse. The divorce is still pending." The happiness of a minute ago was totally overwhelmed by a tense stillness that followed aloud. Collective "oh." All eyes then shifted to Luke, who was mute. The audience was astonished and started to grumble. By the disclosure, Luke was already married, and his spouse was still living. Sarah stared at him in confusion, searching for answers, but he stayed still and silent for a. He seemed to have seen a ghost for a few moments before saying, "No, that's not true. My wife died a very long time ago." His face was one of genuine joy, and his voice sounded unsteady. Confusion. At the same time, the woman at the end of the carpet stood erect, staring at Luke, and then abruptly lifted her ring finger to reveal her wedding band, which bore their names. "I'm Emma, and I'm the legal wife of this man." Sarah, don't be deceived. Sarah, who was utterly confused and furious about what was going on, insisted that Luke tell her what was going on and who that woman was. Then he made a valiant attempt to protect himself. "I've been with you all this time, you know. Don't trust this woman." His voice broke as he yelled at Sarah, clearly nervous. Tension was high as the ceremony came to an abrupt conclusion, and Emma persisted in yelling about her rights as a wife. Because they were unhappy with the circumstances, the guests started to disperse. Luke continued to try to persuade Sarah to believe him and disregard all the woman said in the middle of the commotion. "I have my wife's death certificate, you see," he declared. "This is crazy," trying to find a solution to allay Sarah's concerns. Emma then gave him a defiant look and dared him to get the death certificate and present it to everyone. Luke responded, "I will," his eyes burning with rage as he looked straight at Emma. Emma gave a stubborn nod at that point, turned, and walked away. Since it was obvious that the ceremony was wrecked and that there was no point in continuing, Luke and Sarah also left for home. Additionally, every visitor had already departed, with the exception of their parents. Sarah's parents came up to her and offered if she wanted to spend the night at their house until everything had settled down. She said she wanted to go back to Luke, so they went together, but with a lot of concerns. Luke and Sarah were taken aback to discover who was waiting for them at the door when they got to their house. Emma, naturally, when Luke questioned her what she was doing there. She said that she was there to provide Sarah with the information she needed. He requested her to depart, but Sarah insisted that she should stay since she needed to understand the true situation. Sarah was nervous and thoughtful when she entered the living room, and Emma was pacing back and forth. For his part, Luke said he would go acquire his wife's death certificate and locked himself in his studies. Upon his return, his concern was apparent. "Sarah, I swear that the certificate was here, but I can't seem to locate it. Believe me, though, I just need to locate it. This entire situation is simply an error, or more accurately, a farce." "Luke, don't worry if you claim to have it. It must be somewhere. Come on, I'll help you look for it," she responded, attempting to diffuse the tension and possibly give the man a vote of confidence.